The purpose of this series is to provide an overview of select vintage and modern games, their pros and cons, and what are the essential books and items that you need to play them. With different editions, multiple games appearing to be similar on the surface, and a huge variety of supplements and expansions, newcomers, and even some veterans can often find it a daunting and confusing place to be. This series hopes to lend a helping hand. With the release of the 2024 Dungeons and Dragons rules, with the core set due to be completed in 2025, I thought it was high time to review the game's 5th edition. At 10 years old, this system has accrued a level of maturity, and I'll touch on the 2024-25 update rules in this overview as an illustration of how that maturity is currently manifesting. Make no mistake, the 2024 edition is still 5th edition, carrying few major updates than the traditions from, say, 1st to 2nd Advanced Dungeons & Dragons did. In fact, even including 3 to 3.5, it's probably one of the lightest rules updates to the D&D game we've had, in real terms. But I digress. The main focus of this interview will be on the 2014 rules and how it's progressed up to this point. As we head into 2025, it will be a legacy edition, and so it's fitting that I cover it now on this channel. In 2012, some 2 years after the oddity that was D&D Essentials, basically the last gasp of 4th edition, Wizards of the Coast announced the development of a new edition of Dungeons & Dragons, giving it the name D&D Next. Unlike 3rd and 4th editions, D&D Next had a public playtest, with anyone able to sign up and receive playtest packets, which of course I did. Having been invited to playtest 3rd edition, and enjoying that experience, I could see nothing to lose here. What you received as part of this effort were regular packets of playtest materials, comprising updates to the rules and some example adventures to run using them. An interesting facet here was that the mixture of adventures that appeared in the packets. There were some original adventures designed specifically for the new rules, but also a heady selection of conversions from previous editions, from basic through to 4th, some classic modules such as B2, Keep on the Borderlands, S1, The Tomb of Horrors, and S4, Lost Caverns of Sojkanth, now officially having made it into 5th edition via quests from the Infinite Staircase, were all here, alongside 4th edition D&D Encounters adventures. Some of the time, the playtest adventure material simply comprised bestiaries and converted stats for use with the original published version of the adventures. For some, whole or partial updates were presented. Either way, this was a wealth of adventuring material through which to dive into playtesting, and, even more encouraging, those coordinating the playtest and feedback from playtesters were asking a lot of what I would consider to be the right questions. One of these was, how easy is it to run older adventures using the new rules? The answer, very easy. Certainly easier than, say, running a 1st edition adventure using 3rd edition. Armed with new edition stats, using the original modules pretty much as is was a doddle. Throughout the entire process, I pretty much made my mind up. I liked this edition. From July through to December 2014, starting with the starter set and ending with the Dungeon Master's Guide, the core rules for the now named 5th edition hit the shelves, and thus my 5e library began. Actually, not with the starter set. I didn't feel I needed that, but when Wizards of the Coast started sponsoring Scout badges in the UK, and the starter set became a free offering for UK Scout volunteers, and that running the Mines of Phandelver adventure online for my own group of scouts through COVID lockdowns became a thing, I did pick it up in 2020. So here it was, glossy new edition, done right, which, as far as I'm concerned, means the development of the game involved players and invited feedback, which absorbed many concepts introduced across the entirety of Dungeons & Dragons history. That I could pick up pretty much anything in my cross-edition D&D library and run with it. It was a breath of fresh air. As a side note, it also meant that 4th edition became the major edition with the shortest lifespan in D&D history thus far, 6 years, compared to 3rd edition's 8, 2nd edition's 10, 1st edition's 12, or around that, depending on how you count it, given the monster book came out first, rather than the game's rules, and basics well, another difficult one to count, depending on how differently you view BX from Holmes, from Beckme and all of that. Personally, I don't consider these major additions, so for me, Basic is 1977 through to 1994. For me, though, what let the game down lay not in its rules, but its adventures. I am very much a fan of adventures and other supplemental material existing to support Dungeon Masters, to save them time, to give them options that they can, if they so wish, weave into their own campaigns for the enjoyment of their players. What you may have got a sense of if you've watched my previous Dungeons & Dragons related materials is that I am not a fan of pre-made campaigns, especially highly structured and railroaded ones. I wasn't particularly a fan of 3rd edition's adventure path sequences presented in Dungeon Magazine. I remain somewhat of a fan of the Dragonlance setting, but really dislike the core module series from the 1980s. I loved it when Wizards of the Coast released short, often site-based adventures for 3rd edition, and a number of third-party publishers went down a similar route. I loved that the playtest for 5e involved a mixture of short encounter-style adventures and classic location investigations. But the first adventure, not counting the starter set, for 5e, arriving in August 2014, with a sequel in November, was Horde of the Dragon Queen, a horrible railroad, and among my top 10 of worst D&D modules for exactly that reason. Okay, maybe an anomaly, I thought, but 2015 saw Princes of the Apocalypse and Out of the Abyss. While not quite as egregious as the Dragon Queen adventures, still bad railroads. It was obvious that this was the trend for 5e modules, not the expectation I had from the playtest. With yet another rendition and expansion on Ravenloft, seriously, if there's one saving grace for 4th edition, it's that, other than the board game that I quite like, it remains the only edition of the D&D line started by 1st edition AD&D that doesn't have a rendition of Strahd's Bloody Castle, and another railroad in Storm King's Thunder in 2016. 2017 started to look up, with a compilation of shorter adventures in the shape of Tales from the Yawning Portal, although most of the adventures there had been released in some form, playtest or otherwise, under D&D Next. I quite liked this concept. That is, a hardback containing several short adventures loosely bound by a framing device. This concept was reused in 2021's Candlekeep Mysteries, 2022's Journeys Through the Radiant Citadel, 2023's Keys from the Golden Vault, and 2024's Quest from the Infinite Staircase. I hope they continue more on this trend. It also helps where, if you're buying a compilation, you're more likely to find some elements in it that you like. With a railroad campaign, it's a book almost wasted if the story doesn't appeal. Almost, but I'll come to that. Interspersed between these compilations, we got 2017's Tomb of Annihilation, sort of better in that it provides at least some form of sandbox to allow the PCs to have some agency in events. 2 related Waterdeep adventures in 2018, Dragon Heist, which I would actually recommend to DMs running new games for younger people, and Dungeon of the Mad Mage, which makes the endless corridors of Undermountain a little less tedious than they were in 2nd edition's box sets describing the vast dungeon under the Forgotten Realm city of Waterdeep. Ghosts of Saltmarsh in 2019 brought a classic TSI UK series to 5e, representing and expanding on the old U series into not quite a railroad, but still approaching one. It is one of the better offerings, though. Back to railroads with Descent into Avernus in 2019, and Rime of the Frostmaiden in 2020, with something a little more fun and a little less railroady in Wild Beyond the Witchlight in 2021. An adventure that reintroduces some old action figure and Shady Dragon Inn favourites to the game, such as Strongheart, Kelleck and Warduke. Anyway, this one I quite like, for its refreshing change of pace and, again, a looser style of plot that allows more player agency than most 5e adventures. Call of the Netherdeep in 2022 brought the Critical Role YouTube show to official 5e status. Now, I'm not a fan of watching people play D&D, but I do enjoy the Vox Machina cartoon. Anyway, this book wasn't really for me, so I can't say more about it than that. Shadow of the Dragon Queen, also in 2022, I can say more about, as it's an adventure that returns us to the Dragonlance world, and like clockwork, back to the only part of the Dragonlance world that seems to stick with anyone, the War of the Lance. Anyway, Old Man mumbles about another railroad shoved into a world already replete with railroads. That it came with a very odd board game doesn't help. There was a good Dragonlance board game released back in the day, but I failed to be enamoured by the Warriors of Krynn set. It might be for you, and if you're a Dragonlance fan who has more time for its railroads than I do, that it meshes with the Shadow of the Dragon Queen adventure may give you a good time. A couple of re-releases in 2023 included Tyranny of Dragons, which compiled and supposedly fixed some of the issues with the Horde of the Dragon Queen and Rise of Tiamat adventures from 2014, but no way I was buying that material twice, fixed or not. And Phandelver and Below, the Shattered Obelisk, which is a reiteration and expansion of the 2014 starter set's Mines of Phandelver adventure. This isn't bad, as it still has those elements of hand-holding a new DM through things, and sometimes a railroad helps in that regard. Finally, we get the inevitable apocalyptic end-of-edition adventures. And as we had with the Time of Troubles trilogy going from first to second, and the Apocalypse Stone and Die Vecna Die going from second to third, our pal Vecna returned in 2024 to round out the 2014 iteration of 5e with Eve of Ruin. This adventure is more of a flowchart railroad than a direct one, and its flavour is more one of meet the famous people, but at least, hopefully, it put a capstone on these horrible campaign railroad adventure books. Possibly not, but we'll see. I don't think I've ever used the word railroad so much in a single video. Alongside all of these works, we got a few expansions to the core. The Sword Coast Adventurer's Guide in 2015 was the first of these, and despite its Forgotten Realms attachment, it's actually quite useful. Volo's Guide to Monsters in 2016 expands on monsters, giving some ecology of style articles and options for existing monsters with a gaggle of new beasties. Xanathar's Guide to Everything expands on the Player's Handbook and Dungeon Master's Guide, with new options for characters, new spells, new magic items, and a bunch of new options for play. Reminiscent of the Unearthed Arcana from first edition for me, being split between players and DM sections, and presenting a good variety of things to pick and choose from. A similar companion work, Tasha's Cauldron of Everything, came out in 2020 and was another great addition to the game. More monsters in the shape of Mordenkainen's Tome of Foes in 2018 and Fizban's Treasury of Dragons in 2021 mixed some player and DM options up with Draconic and Draconic-related monster stats. Volo's Guide and Mordenkainen's Tome got combined and updated into Mordenkainen's Monsters of the Multiverse in 2022, a book I didn't mind getting the material twice for, unlike Dragon Queen. And Bigby's Glory of the Giants arrived, covering that subset of monsters in a similar manner to Fizban's Dragons in 2023. Now, here's where those horrible railroad books somewhat redeem themselves a little. See, many of the monsters and elements in the books that I've just described originally came from the adventure tomes that preceded them, but in many ways, the adventures themselves provide better context, especially for monsters, sort of seeing them in action, so to speak. Also, each adventure book has its own collection of NPCs, spells, magic items that make them a collection of new options in and of themselves. If you ignore the railroad plots and take the maps and so on, they also make good sources of locations for use elsewhere and when. Okay, so plots make up a good chunk of these books, but I've still found most of them useful. So perhaps there is something in the Wizards marketing system that is working for me there. Rounding off the litany of releases are 5e's attempts at campaign settings. Some of these are good, some are awful, some I'll mention but not go into much about them because they mean nothing to me. The Guildmaster's Guide to Ravnica describes a world of the Magic the Gathering card game for 5e, one I don't really care for, other than to say, when 5e was first being bandied around, some voices were putting out concerns that Wizards of the Coast were going to go down a greater level of integration between Magic the Gathering and Dungeons & Dragons. Actually, this, along with 2020's Mythic Odysseys of Theros and 2021's Strixhaven, A Curriculum of Chaos, were all that happened in that regard, for which I'm glad. A starter set based on the TV show Stranger Things came out in 2019, and since I'm sort of specific in my watching habits and Stranger Things hasn't persuaded me to give Netflix any money to watch it, that's as much as I can say there. Acquisitions Incorporated also came out in 2019, based on, well, I'm not sure, a live play podcast, I think. I really don't know. I could research it, but I'm as bothered now as I was back then when I didn't buy the book. Another franchise-themed starter set from 2019 was based on the Rick and Morty cartoon. Again, not something I've watched, so not something I picked up. Doing well with these so far, aren't we? It doesn't get much better. Eberron was, other than the Forgotten Realms by default, the first official D&D setting to get a 5e world guide. First released under 3rd edition, I liked the concept of Eberron in principle, but not enough to have ever bought any of its material. Sometimes you can be glad things exist that you personally don't have an interest in, but still feel that they are a worthwhile addition. Eberron adds new scope and concepts to the question, what makes a D&D world? And the more different concepts we have floating around on that score, in D&D and other games, then the more examples of the true answer to that question that we have, which is anything you like. Wildemont in 2020 from the Critical Role setting, which, as I've mentioned, I enjoy the cartoon show from, and the aforementioned Mythic Odysseys of Theros in that same year. In 2021, Van Richten's Guide to Ravenloft arrived, and is actually a reasonable book, good enough to sit alongside the Domains of Dread 2nd edition hardcover on my shelves. Just a little secret. I may moan about Castle Ravenloft being done over and over ad nauseum, but Ravenloft as a setting I quite like. Anyway, more on that when I reach it in view over the milieu. I've already mentioned the book on Strixhaven that also came out in that year. 2 classic D&D settings were revisited in 2022 and 2023, Spelljammer and Planescape, respectively. I've already put my thoughts out on the 5e Spelljammer set. Summary, it's not good. Link in the description if you care to watch that overview. Planescape I haven't yet covered, but I will, and I also think the 5e iteration is somewhat better than the edition's coverage of Spelljammer. One last thing to cover from the official releases, and yes, I've skipped some minor odds and sods, and especially pointless paraphernalia such as the campaign cases on purpose, and that is the Deck of Many Things set. I really do want to cover this in a separate video, as I'm a minor student of tarot, and I want to cover that among certain related subjects, in a similar way to I've done with King Arthur and am working on with Robin Hood. That is, a video on the subject followed up by how that subject works in gaming, or can work in gaming. So I'll save my thoughts on the set for then. On the subject of paraphernalia, back in the 1980s, branded stuff like lunchboxes and so on was a thing that you did when you were a kid. I had Batman kites, plenty of band t-shirts, still do, and a number of other odds and sods with one logo or image on it or another. Such things, being D&D branded, are nothing new. However, with the surge of popularity of the brand under 5e, presumably Hasbro's continuing desire to make as much cash out of it as they can, I feel that 5e has seen D&D enter an era of ridiculousness in this arena, where there does not seem to be anything that familiar ampersand can't be slapped on for a few dollars. Anyway, this is another old man gripe. I love the fact that this funny hobby that I've had for decades is receiving some deserved spots in the limelight. I just shudder at the fact that some of those spots are a tad cheesy and in some ways demeaning. Anyway, moving on. To round out the history, I will briefly touch on third-party elements and the System Reference Document, or the SRD. I mean, I'm not going to get into the whole controversial tit-for-tat stuff over it, but just the side industry itself. Having seen the boom and bust of the 3rd edition D20 side of it, I feel that the third-party cottage industry levelled out to a healthy point after that. What I'm seeing now, especially via Kickstarter and through spaces such as Drive-Thru RPG, is a bubble approaching something similar to that third edition point. We'll see what the future holds and whether this bubble continues to expand during the 2024 rules era or shrinks to a healthier level or something entirely else, but I can't help think been here before. Anyway, there are some good companies out there doing some good material for 5e, and I would especially shout out Kobold Press, despite my vilification of Horde of the Dragon Queen, in which they played a part, Frog God Games, Goodman Games, Green Ronin, and Mythos Chronicles especially, for material that I have especially enjoyed during my time with 5e, and will likely continue to enjoy into the future. The basics of 5e play are exactly the same as the underpinning core introduced, or rather unified, in 3rd edition, and continuing in through 4th. That is, roll 1d20, add whatever modifiers are applicable, and compare to a target number to determine success. That is modern D&D in a nutshell. Everything else is semantics and the specifics of what players, and their foes, can do to affect those modifiers and targets, both their own and those of their opposition. You could argue that this core mechanic has existed through all editions of D&D, and you'd be right, to a certain extent. Within editions prior to 3rd, targets were derived mainly by tabulated cross-references, class versus level versus armor class, class versus level versus attack types for saving throws, or tacked on using ability scores as base roll-under targets for d20 rolls, ability checks and non-weapon proficiencies, for example. From 3rd, all of these equivalences have similar derivations and are all on a succeed on equal or higher than target basis. Also remaining are modifiers from ability scores that can be easily recalled or calculated. I prefer ability score divide by 2, subtract 5. On the subject of ability scores, 5e does some rebalancing that, in my opinion, did get out of hand in 3e. Which is that 5e ability scores have a high-end cap. This is 20 for adventurers and 30 for monsters. This harkens back to the hard limit of 25 that existed in 1st and 2nd. As with 3rd and 4th, 5e is a strongly typed rule set, which, as a C-based programmer, I like. This keeps logical traditions such as modifiers with the same type don't stack and provides good shorthand for capabilities and effects. Resistance, poisoned, incapacitated, grappled, and so on. Doing this bestows that condition. It's an easier and more unified form of language to use. As per previous editions, characters are defined by race, class, and level. Gone is 4e's cumbersome 1/2 level modifier, and in comes proficiency bonus, a modifier the character receives for stuff they have expertise in, from skills to weapons to determining target numbers for saving throws. Proficiency bonus goes up in blocks of 4, so you can mathematically derive it by level divided by 4, round up, add 1. It gives you an easy way to do it off the cuff. Or you can just read it off the table. Race combines with subrace, for example, elf and wood elf, to give a character a set of ability modifiers and special abilities, including proficiencies. Core proficiencies are determined by class, and these include skills, weapon types, and saving throws. Instead of the 3 categories of saving throw from 3e, or 3 of the 4 defense categories from 4e, fortitude, reflex, and will, 5e provides 1 saving throw for each ability score. This opens up the possibility of strength, intelligence, and charisma saves, alongside those traditionally associated with dexterity, constitution, and wisdom. So you can see already that 5e has bits and pieces from a number of editions honed down to a fine point, with some of the unnecessary complexity or board game-esque components either revised or taken out. Core classes included in 5e are Barbarian, Bard, Cleric, Druid, Fighter, Monk, Paladin, Ranger, Rogue, Sorcerer, Warlock, and Wizard. Back to 3e's base, adding the Warlock and returning the Barbarian, Bard, Druid, Monk, and Sorcerer. Remember, we're just talking core here. I realise that many of these classes were introduced in various ways in prior editions. Personally, I would have preferred fewer classes and more subclasses. More on subclasses in a minute, but after all, what is a barbarian other than a fighter of a certain archetype? Similarly for paladins and rangers. But I'm not that fussed, and retaining such classes as full classes does provide more branching options for subclasses. Now, the intent for subclasses, as far as I could tell during playtest, was for them to provide 5e's alternative to prestige classes from 3rd edition and multiclassing from virtually all editions. What is an Eldritch Knight, for example, other than an iteration of the ubiquitous Fighter Mage? They provide specialisation options for characters, narrowing the character's archetype from the base class. But multiclassing is still a thing in 5e, although a fair few prestige classes from 3e have turned up as subclasses in 5e. The 5e subclass concept is okay, but there are a few elements of it that I would have preferred to have been different. For example, cleric subclasses, parallel spheres and domains from previous editions, essentially reflecting the nature of the deities the cleric follows. Here I would have preferred to have clerical subclasses reflecting the cleric's theme, say Defender of the Faith for a more militant cleric, and retain something similar to domains to associate back to the cleric's god. As it is, even though the 5e Player's Handbook lists many examples of pantheons of gods, these are limited in scope to the small handful of cleric subclasses presented, while further sources added more. I found myself increasingly either creating new cleric subclasses or using ones from third-party publishers to fit out this particular area. Bottom line here, I guess, is that I feel clerics get short-changed in theme, while most classes receive reasonable archetype representation within their own subclasses. Within the classes, 5e attempts to balance the classes with each other across a span of 20 levels. This is different to 4th, which used a span of 30 levels, and prior editions which allowed virtually limitless advancement. I think 20 is fine, and matches the theme of the 20-sided die symbology too. Feats from 3e and 4e are still present, but understated a little, usually providing additional proficiencies or the odd modifier here and there. This is nice. One of the failings of 3e, in my opinion, is the feat tree model, which ushered players down paths of thinking about their character at higher levels when they were at the point of creating that character at first level. Characters, in my opinion, should be shaped by the adventures that they go on, and having a more open nature to feats rather than nested feat trees that you have to think of in advance enables this to a better degree. The skills 5e presents takes a leaf out of 4e, in that the overdone list of skills from 3e are honed down to a basic key list. Tool proficiencies are a nice addition, which clear out a lot of unnecessary guff from the skills list. You don't need a blacksmith skill, you just need proficiency in the blacksmithing tools. The skills list is therefore kept pertinent to the act of adventuring, and peripheral things such as crafting are kept in their own area, with the tools needed for those jobs. Combat is much the same as it is in 3e and 4e. Initiative on d20, choose actions for a round, one move, one action, whatever bonus actions you have floating around that might help the given situation, and d20 plus modifier versus armor class as a target number to hit. Nothing rocket science here, but a lot of elements from prior editions are, once again, cleaned up and codified better. Gone or revised are some of the more contentious elements. Opportunity attacks, for example. Each character has a single reaction in each round, which can be used when a foe puts themselves in line for an opportunity attack. This limits things better, but also opens up some tactical choices, whether to use a reaction or not, whether to try and trigger a reaction of someone else. Commander-type foes sending minions through characters' threat areas in order to trigger reactions so they themselves can't be subjected to them, for example. Magic is an overhaul, as it seems to be in every new edition. Vancian magic is still an influence in 5e, with characters only able to prepare a certain number of spells per day, but how they use them is far more flexible than in previous editions. Here there is a separation between the number of spells that can be prepared each day and the number of castings at each spell level that can be used each day, or between each long rest. This serves, as noted, to make spellcasters more flexible, as they can choose which spell level to use to cast a given spell, as long as the slot is of a high enough level compared to the spell's own level. This does away with the complexities of spells with essentially the same effect, for example, restoring hit points, needing to have individual iterations at given levels. For example, cure light wounds, cure moderate wounds, cure serious wounds, cure critical wounds, cure hyperdeath uber wounds. You just need one cure wounds spell. The spell slot used to cast it determines the amount of effect. The same is true of damaging spells tied to caster level. For example, Fireball no longer inflicts 1d6 per caster level. Instead, if cast using a 3rd level spell slot, it does 8d6 points of damage, and you get an additional 1d6 of fiery goodness for every spell slot level used over that. So 9d6 if you use a 4th level slot, 10d6 if you use a 5th level slot, and so on. This is much more elegant and adds further flexibility and options to casters in play. Does a cleric need to prepare cure critical wounds? No, they just prepare cure wounds, and if you come out of a fight with a few cuts, they can burn a 1st level slot on patching you up. Worse than that, and they can use a higher level slot to boost their healing power. One spell, range of options. I want to give you some thoughts that I have regarding running older adventures using 5e and how the experience compares with running older adventures using older editions. And this is something that we were asked to do during playtest, and I feel it has been somewhat glossed over or forgotten in the inevitable edition wars, which, to be fair, Hasbro and Wizards of the Coast haven't particularly been helpful in mitigating with their corporate manoeuvrings. The general upshot is that the feel is different depending on the vintage of a particular adventure, and it can be much easier on the PCs in 5e, especially with long and short rests in play. But the experience is more fun. Many of the bloated, disconnected, or otherwise under the category rules we house ruled out anyway from earlier editions are streamlined and connected in 5e, or omitted altogether, usually with a better replacement. In this way, with an open mind, with partisan views parked for a bit, you might glimpse the familiar lineage and progression that the game has taken over the years. I think 5e succeeds when you can see that and consider it to be like insert whatever edition you want, but refined. Other than the nostalgia and simplicity I get out of the Beckme D&D rules, I do believe that 5e is the best the game has ever been. To really round off, I just want to note a few things that I've referenced in this section to the 2024 rules. Races have been swapped out for species. It's about time. Some games have been doing that for decades. And you only get some abilities from this, certainly not your ability score adjustments. The order of creating characters has changed from the traditional ability scores to race to class selection, to an order that still starts with ability scores but goes for the element a character gets most of their capabilities from, class. Ability score adjustments and some feats and proficiencies now come from backgrounds, which makes more sense. You gain stuff relevant to life at sea from being a sailor, more than from being an elf. Not that elves get sea stuff in 2014, it's just a trite example to illustrate the point. Virtually everything that you know about 2014 5e is applicable to 2024 5e. Sure, some of the classes and spells have been tweaked. Half species are no longer a thing directly, but you can set up being a half-elf or half-orc through your character's background and origin, which also allows for, say, half-orcs that are more human-y or more orc-y or whatever point you want along the human-orc spectrum with ease. But it's definitely the same game, and I'm glad. I also think that 10 years is a good marker for a revision. I would hope that we see another release of the 5e core adjusted for everything learned between 2024 and 2034 at some point. "5e codifies, simplifies, and smooths out many concepts that have bubbled in the Dungeons & Dragons pot since its conception in 1974. It represents a recognisable lineage, even bringing that most alien of D&D editions, 4e, into the fold, and echoes of every edition of the game that has ever been can be seen within its pages. And I'm not saying that because luminary names such as Mordenkainen and Bigny are nostalgically summoned in book titles. I'm talking about the rules and their structures. It is something of a conclusion, but nothing is ever absolutely conclusive in a creative art such as role-playing. In many ways, I'm glad that Wizards of the Coast have seemingly drawn a line under the radical departures that we saw in 3E and 4E, and are now focusing on 5E as a foundation to be polished over time, as it is being with the 2024 release, rather than something to be deconstructed and made into something else. Plenty of other games have followed that core principle, same game over time, and have survived even the shadow of the D&D behemoth for years. Call of Cthulhu, for example, is still a recognisable game if you view its current 7th edition from a mindset of its 1st edition. So the concept isn't a new one. The game does what D&D has always done. Present superheroic fantasy characters with escalating threats within intriguing settings. It has always been a hodgepodge cauldron of myth and legend. You could say that D&D's default lore ties together all of humanity's truck with myth over time. And this is where it excels. If you want realism, don't look for it in D&D. If you want simulationist gaming, either in a Second Life model or within the tactical situations, or both, don't look for it in D&D. If you want to have a blast with a bunch of misfits that can chuck battle axes and throw fireballs around, defeating dragons and giants as they go to save the nation, that's exactly what D&D does, and 5e does this better than any other edition. If it wasn't for the fact that it takes about 5 times longer to create a 5e character over a BECMI one, it'd be my favourite D&D edition, hands down. Anyway, there you go. An ancientish gamer who likes 5e. I'm not sure if that's a rare breed or not. It still doesn't make D&D my favourite role-playing game, and I still think the hubris of putting the world's greatest role-playing game on the front cover of the new core book speaks volumes. That's a massively subjective statement, and wholly depends on the metric that you're using to determine that. For me, I much prefer the oldest role-playing game epithet that some third-party publishers are using. That, at least, is objective, at least with regard to what constitutes a recognisable role-playing game form that we know today. All you really need is the player's handbook. Obviously, look out for the 2024 editions if you want the most up-to-date rules. The Monster Manual, as usual, provides monsters, and the Dungeon Master's Guide provides advice for DMs. The 2024 Dungeon Master's Guide is especially good at this. Beyond that, with the usual additions of dice, pencils and paper, and I think people sometimes miss this point, nothing else is needed. You do not need hundreds of pounds of scenery, a billion miniatures, or a woolly jumper with a D&D ampersand knitted into it wearing a Santa's hat. Options are fun to have, but be wise in which you pick up. You do not need D&D Beyond or a digital platform at all, unless you want to play that way. There may be a preferred direction of travel for Hasbro and Wizards of the Coast for the D&D game, but we are far from that destination, if indeed we will ever reach it at all. "5e is a great edition of Dungeons & Dragons, even if the world's greatest epithet doesn't absolutely suit. While the campaign adventures published thus far leave much to be desired, there's a lot of good short adventures, both official and third-party, that are much better fare. The third-party market offers plenty of additional materials of a wide span of quality, even if it is running the risk of another D20 bubble burst. And all in all, 5e provides exactly what a game should. Hours upon hours of fun."